Welcome to this lecture on motivation in the voice studio through the lens of self-determination theory. This presentation grows out of a simple observation. Voice teachers spend years learning about breath, resonance, registration, diction, repertoire, style, and vocal health, but we often spend far less time asking why students engage, persist, practice, and grow. Yet motivation shapes almost every part of the voice lesson. It influences whether students practice between lessons, whether they take risks, how they respond to feedback, and how they build a long-term relationship with singing. Today, we will look at self-determination theory, often abbreviated as SDT, and use it as a practical framework for both teaching and taking voice lessons. The goal is not to replace vocal technique, but to show that technique is learned more deeply when singers feel empowered, capable, and connected. Let's begin with a question. Why do some singers stay deeply engaged while others slowly lose motivation? Two singers may have similar talent, similar access to lessons, and similar performance opportunities, yet one becomes increasingly curious and resilient while the other begins to practice less, avoid challenges, or feel disconnected from the work. We sometimes explain this by saying one student is simply more disciplined, more gifted, or more serious. But educational psychology invites us to look beyond personality labels. It asks us to examine the learning environment. How does the lesson make the student feel? Do they experience choice? Do they see progress? Do they feel known and supported? Those questions matter because motivation is not just something students bring into the studio. It is something the studio can either cultivate or undermine. Here's our roadmap. First, we will consider why motivation matters so much in voice lessons specifically. Voice study is not just cognitive or technical. It is embodied, emotional, and deeply personal. Second, we will introduce self-determination theory and its three basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Third, we will translate each need into specific voice studio practices for teachers and singers. Finally, we will bring the whole framework together and imagine what a motivated studio culture could look like. Technique matters. Let's be very clear about that. Students need accurate information about breathing, resonance, articulation, style, and musicianship. But technique alone does not produce excellence. A teacher can give a brilliant correction, but if the student does not understand it, care about it, believe they can apply it, or practice it consistently, the correction will not become part of the singer's skill. Motivation affects the quality of practice, the willingness to revise habits, the response to feedback, and the patience required for slow change. In other words, motivation is not an extra. It is one of the conditions that allow technical instructions to become actual learning. Voice learning is uniquely personal because the singer's instrument is not an external object. It is the body. When a pianist is told to change fingering, that feedback can feel personal. But when a singer is told that the sound is tense, swallowed, unsupported, unfocused, or not communicating, that feedback can land very differently. Voice is tied to identity, emotion, language, culture, confidence, and self-image. Progress is also non-linear. A singer may sound better one day and worse the next because the voice is affected by sleep, stress, health, hormones, emotions, and environment. Because of this, motivation in the voice studio is not only about work ethic, it is also about emotional safety, self-trust, and the learner's belief that growth is possible. When motivation is overlooked, the studio may still look productive on the surface. Students attend lessons, sing assigned repertoire, take notes, and prepare for juries or recitals. But underneath, they may be complying rather than owning the work. Practice may become inconsistent, mechanical, or driven by fear. Feedback may increase anxiety instead of improving strategy. Some students may continue to succeed because they are talented, fast learners, or good at pleasing teachers, but their motivation may be fragile. Over time, this can lead to burnout, avoidance, shallow learning, or dependence on the teacher. A motivationally supportive studio aims for something deeper. Students who gradually become self-directed, reflective, resilient, and artistically engaged. Self-determination theory was developed by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. It is one of the most influential approaches to motivation in psychology and education. SDT asks a different question from many traditional approaches. Instead of asking, how do we make students do what we want? It asks, under what conditions do people become willing, engaged, and self-directed? This distinction matters. In the Voice Studio, we are not simply trying to get students through the next jury, role, recital, or audition. We are trying to help them build the inner resources to continue learning beyond us. SDT gives us a language for that kind of motivation. One reason SDT is useful is that it treats motivation as more than a simple yes or no condition. A student may be motivated by external pressure. I have to sing this because it is required. They may be motivated by guilt or ego. I should practice because I do not want to disappoint my teacher. They may be motivated by identified value. This matters to my artistic goal. Or they may be intrinsically motivated. I am curious, engaged, and I want to explore this. In real life, singers often experience a mixture of these. The question is not whether every lesson feels fun or purely intrinsic. The question is whether the studio helps students internalize the value of work so motivation becomes more self-directed over time. SDT argues that human motivation thrives when three basic psychological needs are supported: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy is the feeling that I have meaningful choice and ownership. Competence is the feeling that I can grow, improve, and meet challenges. Relatedness is the feeling that I belong and that I am connected to others. For singers, these can be translated into three powerful statements: I choose this, I can do this, and I belong here. When a voice studio supports all three, students are more likely to practice with purpose, receive feedback productively, take artistic risks, and persist through difficulty. A voice studio is not just a location where lessons happen. It is a motivational climate. Every policy communicates values. Attendance policy tells students what responsibility means. Repertoire policies tell students whether their artistic identity matters. Feedback patterns tell students whether mistakes are safe. Studio class norms tell students whether peers are collaborators or competitors. Even small moments matter. How a teacher responds when a student is nervous, how success is celebrated, how errors are framed, and whether students are invited to participate in their own learning. SDT helps us become more intentional about the climate we create. Let's begin with the first need: autonomy. Autonomy is often misunderstood, especially in traditional training environments. Some teachers hear the word autonomy and assume it means students do whatever they want, reject expertise, or avoid structure. That is not what SDT means. Autonomy is not the absence of guidance. It is the experience of ownership inside a meaningful structure. In the voice studio, autonomy means the student is not treated as a passive recipient of corrections, but as an active participant in learning. Autonomy can be summarized as the feeling, I chose this. That does not mean the student chooses every exercise, every song, or every technical goal. It means the student understands the purpose of the work and has some meaningful role in shaping it. Autonomy is ownership, not isolation. It is choice within structure, not freedom from responsibility. When students experience autonomy, they are more likely to internalize the value of practice. They stop working only because the teacher told them to and begin working because the goals make sense to them. It is important to name what autonomy is not. Autonomy is not lower standards. It is not abandoning expertise. It is not avoiding correction or turning every decision into a vote. A voice teacher still has responsibility for safety, sequencing, repertoire appropriateness, and technical priorities. But an autonomy supportive teacher explains decisions, offers meaningful options, and invites the student to reflect. Instead of saying, "Do this because I said so," the teacher helps the student understand why the task matters and how it connects with their goals. That kind of structure can actually increase respect for the teacher's expertise because the student experiences it as supportive rather than controlling. Autonomy supportive teaching can begin with small shifts. Offer meaningful options. For example, would you like to start with breath coordination or vowel clarity today? Explain the why behind tasks. We are using this exercise to help you practice maintaining rib cage expansion before we apply it to the song. Invite input on lesson goals. What felt different in your practice this week? Use language that supports ownership. Try noticing what changes when, rather than "you're doing it wrong." These shifts do not remove rigor, they make rigor more meaningful. Repertoire selection is one of the clearest places to support autonomy. This does not mean students should sing anything they want at any time. It means repertoire can be a collaborative decision. A teacher might provide a curated list of 5 songs that meet a technical goal and allow the students to choose 2. A student might bring repertoire that resonates with their identity, background, or career goals, and the teacher can help evaluate fit, difficulty, and developmental purpose. Autonomy is especially important when students cross genres, explore musical theater, opera, art song, commercial music, spirituals, or repertoire connected to cultural identity. When repertoire feels meaningful, students often practice with more investment. One of the simplest autonomy supports is explaining the why. Many vocal exercises are abstract. A student may sing lip trills, semi-occluded vocal tract, SOVT exercises, vowel patterns, agility patterns, or resonance tuning exercises without understanding the purpose. When teachers explain the purpose, the exercise becomes a tool rather than a ritual. When students understand why they are doing something, they can practice more intelligently outside the lesson. Autonomy is not only a teacher's responsibility. Singers can also practice ownership. Ask questions about purpose. If an exercise helps, ask why it helped. If a practice strategy confuses you, ask how to use it at home. Track your personal goals, not just your assignments. Notice what helps your voice respond. Reflect after lessons. What changed today? What do I understand better? What will I try before the next lesson? A self-directed singer does not reject guidance. They engage with guidance actively. When singers feel heard and involved, practice becomes less about compliance and more about commitment. This is a major shift. Compliance can produce short-term results, especially in highly structured environment. But commitment produces deeper learning. Commitment means the student can carry the work outside the studio, make choices in practice, and connect technique to artistic purpose. The goal is not to make students dependent on motivation in the emotional sense. The goal is to help them build ownership so that motivation becomes more stable and self-directed. Self-check, autonomy. The second psychological need is competence. If autonomy is I choose this, competence is I can do this. Competence is the feeling that effort is leading somewhere. It does not mean the student already performs perfectly. It means they experience themselves as capable of growth. This is especially important in voice study because progress can be slow, inconsistent, and difficult to hear in the moment. A major role of the teacher is to make growth visible. Competence is confidence built through evidence. It grows when students have repeated experiences of making progress. These experiences do not have to be dramatic. A student might feel a smoother onset, sustain a phrase more comfortably, navigate a passaggio with less fear, or communicate text more clearly. Competence grows when the challenge is high enough to matter, but not so high that the student feels helpless. The key phrase here is growth over perfection. Perfection can make students feel constantly inadequate. Progress gives them something concrete to build on. A perfection-centered studio can unintentionally damage competence. If every lesson is organized around what is still wrong, students may conclude that they are never improving. They may become anxious, defensive, or overly dependent on approval. A growth-centered studio does not ignore problems. It names them clearly, but it also helps students notice change. The question becomes, what changed? What caused the change? And what can we build from here? This keeps feedback tied to learning rather than judgment. It also teaches students how to evaluate their own singing in a healthier way. Scaffolding is one of the most important ways to build competence. Instead of asking students to solve everything at once, the teacher breaks a complex skill into manageable steps. For example, before expecting a full phrase with text, musicality, resonance, breath, diction, and acting, the teacher might isolate breath flow, then vowel alignment, then rhythm, then text, and then expressive intention. Scaffolding does not simplify the art form permanently. It creates a pathway into complexity. Students are more motivated when they can succeed at the next step rather than feeling crushed by the final product. Feedback plays a central role in competence. Feedback that builds confidence is specific rather than global. Good job feels pleasant, but it may not teach the student what to repeat. That phrase became easier when you allowed the vowel to modify earlier, gives usable information. Competence supportive feedback also focuses on effort and strategy rather than talent alone. Instead of saying, you're just naturally good at this, we can say, the way you slowed that passage down in practice helped you coordinate it today. This teaches students that success is earned, understandable, and repeatable. Goals make progress visible. In the voice studio, we can use goals at multiple levels: short-term goals, medium-term goals, and long-term goals. Goals also need criteria. How will we know progress happened? The clearer the criteria, the easier it is for competence to grow. Competence grows between lessons, so practice design matters. Students often leave lessons with vague instructions like work on support or keep it forward. Those phrases may make sense in the room, but they may not translate into independent practice. A competence supportive assignment is specific and repeatable. For example, sing this 4-measure phrase on vowels first, then add text. Listen for tone and vibrato consistency. This gives the student a task, a sequence, and an evaluation focus. When students know what to listen for, they can become partners in their own improvement. Singers can build competence by collecting evidence of growth. Keep a journal, even if it is brief. Write down what worked, what changed, and what questions remain. Celebrate small wins. Maybe the breath lasted longer today. Maybe the high note felt a little less like a leap and more like a continuation. Maybe diction was clearer without extra tension. Use recording strategically, not as a tool for criticism, but as a source of information. Most importantly, compare today with your past self rather than constantly comparing yourself to other singers. Comparison can sometimes inspire, but it can also distort your sense of progress. There are several competence traps. The first is only correcting errors. If students only hear what is wrong, they may lose sight of what is improving. The second is setting goals that are too vague or too large. Fixture technique is not a goal. It is an overwhelming cloud. The third is praise without information. Students need to know what worked and why. The fourth is confusing struggle with failure. Some struggle is part of learning. A singer may sound temporarily less polished because they are rebuilding coordination. Competent supportive teaching helps students understand productive struggle so they do not interpret every difficulty as evidence that they are failing. Confidence grows when success feels earned and visible. Many students think confidence has to come before action, but often confidence comes from repeated experiences of effective action. The studio can help students see those experiences. We can document progress, revisit recordings, name specific changes, and connect effort to results. When students believe, I can improve because I have evidence that I have improved before, motivation becomes much more durable. Self-check. Competence. The third need is relatedness. If autonomy is I choose this, and competence is I can do this, relatedness is I belong here. Relatedness may be the most emotionally obvious need in voice study because singing is vulnerable. Students are not only learning a skill, they are revealing sound, text, body, emotion, language, and identity in front of another person. A singer who does not feel safe may protect themselves, and that protection can show up vocally, artistically, and motivationally. Relatedness is the feeling that I belong here. It includes emotional safety, trust in the teacher, trust in the teacher-student relationship, connection with peers, and a sense of place in the broader musical community. In the studio, relatedness does not mean avoiding challenge or making every moment comfortable. It means students believe that challenge is offered in support of their growth, not as humiliation or rejection. When students trust the environment, they are more willing to be brave. Connection builds courage. This is not sentimental, it is pedagogically practical. A student who feels judged may avoid trying the unfamiliar coordination because it might sound ugly. A student who feels isolated may not ask the question they need to ask. A student who feels that mistakes are unsafe may stay in a narrower artistic range. But a student who feels supported is more likely to experiment, make mistakes, and recover. That willingness to risk is essential in voice training because new vocal habits often feel strange before they feel reliable. For teachers, relatedness begins with listening to more than the sound. Of course, we listen to vowels, resonance, breath, registration, and text. But we also listen to students' experience of learning. Are they confused, discouraged, excited, afraid? Are they avoiding a task because they do not care or because they feel incapable? We can invite reflection without forcing disclosure. A simple question like, how did that feel? Or what did you notice? Can open the door. Relatedness does not require teachers to become therapists. It requires respectful attention to the human being who is learning. Relatedness also extends beyond the one-on-one lesson. Studio community matters. Group classes can become places where students learn from one another. Peer feedback can also be powerful when norms are clear. Feedback should be specific, respectful, and focused on growth. Recitals can be framed not only as evaluations, but as community events where students witness one another's development. When a studio culture emphasizes mutual support rather than constant comparison, students are more likely to feel that they belong in the learning process. Singers can support relatedness by refusing to learn in isolation. Trust the learning partnership enough to ask questions, name confusion, and share when a strategy is not translating into practice. Connect with peers. Attend studio classes and recitals. Listen generously to other singers. Let support become part of practice. This does not mean depending on constant reassurance. It means recognizing that singing develops inside relationships with teachers, coaches, pianists, directors, peers, audiences, and communities. Motivation is often sustained by those relationships. Relatedness can be undermined in several ways. Fear-based teaching may produce short-term compliance, but it can damage trust and long-term motivation. Competitive studio climates can push some students, but they may also create comparison, secrecy, and anxiety. Ignoring students' identity and context can make the studio feel narrow or unsafe. Treating vulnerability as weakness can make students hide the very information teachers need in order to help them. A relatedness supportive studio maintains standards while communicating that students are valued as whole people. Belonging fuels bravery. Students take more risks when they feel supported. This matters because voice learning requires risk. It requires trying sounds that may be unfamiliar, allowing the body to coordinate differently, performing before one feels fully ready, and receiving feedback on something deeply personal. A studio that supports relatedness helps students stay open to that process. Self-check, relatedness. Now that we have examined autonomy, competence, and relatedness separately, we need to bring them together. In practice, these needs interact. A studio cannot focus on only one and ignore the others. A student needs choice, but also guidance. They need challenge, but also evidence of progress. They need emotional safety, but also meaningful standards. The most powerful application of SDT happens when all three needs are balanced and supported together. Balance is key. Autonomy without competence can leave students overwhelmed. Competence without autonomy can produce polished singers who still feel dependent and controlled. Relatedness without competence can create a warm environment that does not challenge students enough. Competence without relatedness can create achievement without belonging. In an ideal studio culture, students have meaningful choice, clear evidence of growth, and supportive relationships. This combination creates the conditions for lasting motivation. When one need is missing, motivation becomes fragile. Choice without support can feel like abandonment. A teacher may think they are encouraging autonomy, but if the student lacks sufficient skill or guidance, they may feel lost. Challenge without progress can feel like failure. A student may work hard but lose motivation if they cannot see improvement. Community without growth can become comfort without development. Skill without belonging can become isolation. SDT encourages us to ask not only whether students are working hard, but whether the environment is meeting their psychological needs. Self-determination theory can be applied at multiple levels. A single lesson can support autonomy by giving the student a choice. competence by naming progress, and relatedness by listening carefully. A semester can reinforce these needs through goals, reflection, studio class norms, and repertoire planning. A curriculum can develop them over years by gradually increasing student ownership, technical independence, artistic agency, and community responsibility. A studio culture can normalize these practices so motivation is not left to chance. Even studio policies can be designed through SDT. Attendance policies can communicate responsibility while still acknowledging student humanity. Practice journals can support autonomy and competence by helping students reflect and track progress. Studio class can support relatedness through shared learning and peer feedback. Juries can support competence when they include a growth narrative, not only a final judgment. The question is not whether policies should exist. Structure is necessary. The question is whether policies support ownership, progress, and belonging, or whether they only produce compliance. Practice assignments can also reflect SDT. A strong assignment includes purpose, task, criteria, reflection, and a next choice. Purpose answers why the task matters. Task tells the student what to do. Criteria tells them what to listen for or notice. Reflection asks them to evaluate what happened. Next choice gives them agency in deciding what to bring back to the next lesson. The Self-Determination Studio is a studio where students make informed choices, progress is visible and celebrated, feedback is clear and growth-based, community supports courage, and technique serves artistic agency. This does not mean every lesson is easy or every student is constantly happy. Motivation is not the same as comfort. A motivated studio can still be rigorous, demanding, and serious, but its rigor is framed through ownership, growth, and belonging. Students are not merely corrected, they are developed. Here's a practical audit for teachers. Ask yourself, where do students have meaningful choice? How do students know they are improving? Where do students experience belonging? Which need is least supported right now? This audit can be applied to a lesson, a studio class, a syllabus, a jury process, or an entire curriculum. The goal is not perfection. The goal is awareness. Once we can identify which need is under-supported, we can make small changes that have large motivational effects. Singers can use a parallel audit. What choices am I making in my learning? What evidence shows I am improving? Who supports my growth? What do I need to communicate more clearly? These questions help singers move from passive participation to active learning. A singer who can answer these questions is more likely to practice intentionally, respond to feedback constructively, and build a sustainable relationship with their voice. The final message is this: if we want better technique and better engagement, we should start with motivation. That does not mean ignoring vocal science or musicianship. It means recognizing that technique is learned by human beings, and human beings learn best in environments that support agency, growth, and connection. When students feel empowered, skilled, and connected, they do not just sing more, they sing better. They learn more deeply. They recover from setbacks more effectively. They become not only better performers, but more reflective and sustainable musicians.